Let's talk about banks. Ever wonder where money comes from? Well, when you were young, you were probably told that it doesn't magically grow on trees. I certainly was. Well, that's only partially true. Private banks create money, and they create it magically, out of nothing. What's really frightening is that these banks are owned by private investors. It's exactly the same in almost every country in the world. Governments allow these wealthy individuals to create our money. If you think that's scary, wait till you hear the rest. So here's how it works. Let's say I open a bank, Peter's Bank. My slogan is, try your luck, deposit your buck. Just so people know that I really mean business. Now, I've gone to my buddies and I've raised 10,000 bucks in investment money, and I've stuck that in my vault. That money is now what we call reserves. Now, you may have heard that banks run on a fractional reserve system. It sounds complicated, but it's really not. You see, the government requires banks to keep a fraction of the money that they lend out in reserve. In the United States, that fraction is 10%. That means banks have to have on hand 10% of the money that they lend out. Now, that might sound reasonable until you put it under a microscope. In my bank, Peter's Bank, I have $10,000 in the vault. And that means that I can lend out $90,000 because I have to keep 10% on hand. Now, $10,000 is 10% of $100,000, 90 plus 10. Okay, so let's say that you need a loan of $50,000 to buy a new car. Well, that's okay because my bank can lend out $90,000 even though we don't actually have it. I only have $10,000 in reserve. Well, that's because I can create digital money. So I press a computer key and guess what? $50,000 appears in your account. Instant digital money. Now, let's go look at my bank's balance sheet to see how I make that work accounting-wise. If you know about balance sheets, you know both sides have to balance. Liabilities have to balance with assets. So I enter $50,000 as a liability because that's money that I owe you as per our loan agreement. But I also get to register the same amount as an asset, something of value, as it's money that will hopefully be repaid. I will eventually have $50,000 back. It's considered an asset even though there's nothing there but debt. Normally with an asset, it's a physical thing like a house or a car. But in a bank's case, they're allowed to call debt an asset. Crazy, eh? But what's even crazier is what happens when you pay back that digital money. It disappears into thin air, where it came from. Balance sheets, you see, have to balance. So no more liability, no more asset. Poof, it's all gone. Now, when banks create digital loans, it puts money into the economy. Now, that's inflationary. When the money gets repaid or there's a default, it actually disappears into the digital ether. That's deflationary. And that's the business of banking, creating money from nothing, then charging you interest for it, and then destroying that digital money again when it's paid back. Oh, when they like to nickel and dime you to death. Well, you know that. They're really good at that part. It takes a little while to wrap your head around this system because it's so unbelievable. And banks don't want you to know any of this. Oh, but it gets much worse. Let's go back to that car that you bought with the $50,000 loan backed up by 10% in reserves. Now, when you pay the dealer for that new car, that $50,000 goes into another bank. That bank can count that money as their reserves. After all, it's digital cash, and they don't know where it came from. In other words, they don't know it's a loan, and they don't know that it's only backed up by that original $10,000. That means they can lend out up to 9 times that amount, or $450,000, all backed up by that original $10,000. But that $10,000 is in another bank, which means this new loan isn't backed up at all. And then that brand new digital $450,000 goes into other banks and the debt just keeps piling up with nothing to support it. It's a Ponzi scheme. Now, in the legal world, it would be considered outright fraud, but governments allow it and misrepresent what's going on. But get this, before March of this year in 2020, 6 countries in the world, only 6 countries, had no reserve requirement at all. One of those countries is Canada. Banks in Canada don't have to keep any money on reserve, and for the most part, they don't. But in March, the central banks did away with the requirement to keep any reserves at all at any banks in any country. So banks are now able to gamble as much money as you give them on mortgages and other loans. And that's in countries around the world. Sounds like a remake of the movie Dumb and Dumber to me. Now, everything's okay as long as the debt keeps on expanding and everybody pays back the money they owe. But when the economy falters and mortgages and businesses start collapsing, when people lose their jobs, those people tend to come to the bank for their savings. And surprise, there isn't enough money to go around. So what we end up with is a bank run. First one in line wins. But you might say that, the first $100,000 of your bank account is insured. Well, that's certainly the case in Canada. And you would be technically correct. In Canada, we have the CDIC, the Canadian Deposit Insurance Corporation, and they do just that. They insure the first $100,000 of your bank account. But according to their annual report, they have assets of only 0.36% of the amount that they're insuring. That's 1/3 of 1%. Well, that sure won't go far. And in the U.S., the numbers are a whole bunch worse. Now, here's something else they don't tell you. When you deposit your money in a bank, you're actually investing it in that bank's business. Now, by law, it's not your money anymore. You're depositing it on the promise that these private banks will pay it back, if they have it. And for the use of your money, they pay you what, about 1% a year? That's $10 for every $1,000 that you invest. Yikes! That's why you want to pay particularly close attention to the economy over the next few years, because if there's even the slightest indication that any of the big banks are facing issues, like mortgage defaults, and boy, we know they're coming, I'd want to be the first one in line to get what rightfully belongs to me, law or no law. You see, banks promote the fact that they have billions of dollars in assets. But as I've just shown you, that's actually not true. It's debt, pure and simple. And that's why we often refer to bankers as banksters, like gangsters. Remember my bank slogan, try your luck, deposit your buck? Hey, stay safe out there. Keep your eyes and ears open.